The most recent episode of The Acolyte introduced a very, shall I say, odd dynamic where we saw one of the head witches turn into what I can only describe as an ashy dementor. We now have comments from Leslye Headland explaining that what the head witch was doing was transforming into the Force. And not only was she transforming herself into the Force, but she was also transforming May into the Force as well. Before we get to this, I'd like to ask you, please hit that subscribe button, hit that bell, so you don't miss any of our future videos here at the Trent Report. Also, hit that like button. Let's send this video into the upper echelons of the YouTube algorithm so more people can watch this. Joining me, we also have a special guest joining me to discuss this is Star Wars lore expert, Lorne Connor. How are you doing, sir?
Good. How are you, Joe?
I am doing well, and I am excited to talk to you about this subject because when I read this, I was just like, what in the world is she even talking about? What is going on here? And so I wrote this up over at thatparkplace.com. So let's just get into what Leslye Headland had to say here first. And in case you don't know what actually happened, this is a little brief video here that Gary shared from the episode. You can see that she turns into this like ashy dementor type character. So you can see she's turning into the ash. May is turning into ash as well. And then our friend here, Lee Jung-jae, Master Soul, decides to kill her because he has no idea what she's doing. It looks dark, evil, and whatever, and just stabs her before she dissipates, and she ends up dying there. So that's what happens. Who know what was going on there? We didn't really realize what was happening. It looked like she was just channeling some kind of dark magic, right?
Yeah, I mean that's what it looks like.
Okay. So, but she did this interview with Nerdist, and she was asked about this scene. She says that Nerdist asked her, when May asks for help, Anastasia not only starts dematerializing her own body, she makes May turn into a shadow as well. What can you tell us about what exactly is happening there and why? And this is what Leslye Headland said. Anastasia's main concern is that violence will be used in this confrontation. Jodie Turner-Smith and I talked about that meaning two things. One, that Anastasia must have come from some place that utilized violence, is something she would have seen when she was a child, something that she would have endured in her coming of age. So the main concern is obviously the safety of her children, the physical safety of them. The secondary concern is I do not want my children or my legacy to be affected by something violent. I want to remove them from whatever that is. So just to provide a little bit more context, right before she kind of turns into this ashy dementor creature, there's a face-off between the Jedi and the other lesbian witch character, Coral. Her name is Coral, the Zabrak. So it looks like violence is going to be taking place right before this. Nevertheless, Headland goes on and says this. The why about the dematerializing is the first thing that Jodie and I talked about in seeding the character. What she is doing is what Jackie says in episode 4, that it's an honor to see anyone transform into the Force. I believe that Anastasia is transforming herself and May into the Force in a way that doesn't kill them. So what do you make of this, Lauren?
That's not how the Force works at all. I think it's funny that well, I guess I would start here. I've always liked the dichotomy of the fact that the Sith want immortality above all else and can never achieve it because they're trying to grasp it, where the Jedi achieve that by accepting that death is a natural part of life and accepting that at the moment of their death, and that is how they transform into the Force. In the old EU, the Sith were handled in a way that they could sort of achieve a half victory, in that they could bind themselves to an object, a place, or something like that, but they were chained to it. They were essentially powerless and could accomplish nothing unless they were able to convince somebody to be subordinate to their bidding. And that is the antithesis of what the Sith actually want. It's a kind of living hell for them, unless someone happens to come along that they can corrupt and potentially possess. The Disney version seems to be that no, they can't even do that. The Sith have no ability to retain their identity after death. So, this version, that whatever these witches have or do, um, one, if that's the case, it makes them greater in power than the Sith, and also to the Jedi in a way. But then you have to call into question what she means when she says transforming into the Force but not dying, because that's the literal definition of transforming into the Force. In the prequel era mythology, George explained the Force slightly differently than he had before, in that there was not only a light and dark aspect, but there was also the living and the cosmic Force. And the idea was that the cosmic force feeds into the living force to create new life, but the cosmic force is fed by the force energy of those who die. So you have this constant rejuvenation in kind of a wheel cycle. And this wouldn't play any part in that. That treats it as though somehow these witches are outside of that life cycle as defined by George. So once again, they're contradicting the way that George viewed this entire universe, and I think that means that you can't accept this as canon if you want to stay true to what George's beliefs in the Star Wars universe were.
I think you're right. And so just to be clear, we do see this. We do see Coral actually turn into this like witch, Dementor creature later on in the episode, and she actually avoids the fate of the other witches that are, in my opinion, killed by Trinity via forced lobotomy. And she like uses her force powers to shoot them out. So this is something that you're talking about. There is how they're kind of outside of this dynamic of the force. This is actually something that Leslye Headland talks about as well, because she views the witches as, this is how she kind of describes their power, as different from the Night Sisters. She says the Night Sisters utilize magic exclusively. With my witches, it's a bit of a hybrid. They're definitely dabbling in the force. Remember, she doesn't actually say that in the show. The show, they say they call it the thread. They don't, they like, some call it the force, but they're literally calling it the thread, like it's almost a different ability. But now she's saying that it is the force. It is in actuality the force, and calling the force by a different name. They're trying to cultivate their sensitivity to it without having to be trained by the Jedi. Is that even possible? And she continued, but I also think that in the Ascension ceremony, you see how they're utilizing not just wherever the virgins may be physically on the planet, but the eclipse, these powerful movements of heavenly bodies and whatever's under the earth, that type of thing. What is meant to be expressed there is that they are drawing their power from nature, magic, and the force. So we never sort of go, they're using magic the way that the Night Sisters are. They're using the force, even though they're not Jedi. So what do you make of that? And kind of how you're talking about how they were already kind of outside of the force there.
Well, what I read that is a far more complicated way to say "as above, so below," which goes straight into witchcraft. I think that this is someone who claims that Star Wars was very important in their life, that this saved their life, but I don't think they really have a very deep knowledge of Star Wars. I think they had a particular story that they wanted to tell in a particular way. They didn't really care if it meshed with the lore that went before. And frankly, the way that they're speaking in this interview, I get the impression that they sort of thought the audience would just go along with it. I think they probably set out to tell a story, figuring that people would just accept whatever the story was, and is a little startled that they're getting as much backlash as they are. And so this reads to me like somebody just saying a bunch of words to try and paper over the fact that they're not fitting in with the Star Wars cosmology, and it's a form of backpedaling while trying to appear that that's not what they're actually doing.
Yeah, the thing that I had with this a lot was the fact that none of this is actually like explained in the episodes, or you can't even glean anything from it. At least when George talks about the Force in a lot of his interviews, you can see it. You see what he's talking about. You see those themes or whatever he happens to be talking about. You see that in the actual movies. Maybe you didn't see it the first time, but when he kind of explains it, you go back and you see it. And you're like, oh yeah, I do see what he's getting at there. This, it's just like it's not even there. Like what? Like what are you talking about?
Now, speculating a little bit outside of what's given as canon, either even in the old EU or where we're at now, um, I think one thing that startled people when the prequels came out was the idea that the Jedi were taking Force-sensitive children and bringing them to the temple, and various forms of media have shown that in different kinds of ways. One of the first novels that was dealing with that I can think of was Darth Maul Shadowhunter, and in that one you had a character actually with my name, Lorne Pavan. Who was dealing with some ambivalent feelings about the fact that his sister had been taken by the Jedi, and there was a kind of a question as to whether families consented to this or not. Other media have shown that they actually do, but that there's some sensitivity around that, and I think that's kind of what the Acolyte is trying to tackle. This idea that the Jedi are baby stealers. And I think that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And I can kind of understand why until you start thinking about the implications of force powers presenting in the young. And there are other stories like this, like Firestarter or something like that. If you
X-Men.
consider, yeah, if you consider the fact that you have these young people that are going through trying to learn how to harness these abilities that give them extraordinary powers, that's a loaded gun. And what the Jedi are doing is they're trying to approach these families who may not know how to deal with this and say, look, part of what we're going to do here is try to teach discipline and control. And the idea that emotions can take you in a direction that is dangerous for a being like you, that wouldn't be dangerous for somebody that does not have this special ability. So, what we're going to provide is a place where we can learn not to completely disassociate, but to be master of your emotions so that you can have control of this ability and not be harmful to others. And that's why I think the Jedi, I can understand why they would be misunderstood by the Galactic Society as a whole. But when you're dealing with powers that have the equivalent power of a loaded gun in the hand of a child, you have to do something to try and make sure that they're able to handle those abilities. And I would also add that people do wash out of the Jedi, and the Jedi let them go. They either have a function in the Agra Corps or are placed in job functions elsewhere supporting the Jedi, or they can leave the Order entirely. They're not kept prisoners. These guys are not bad guys, but they have developed a system to try and make sure that if you have these kind of abilities, you learn how to govern them in a responsible way.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. They do try, and I think they do try. She does try and make some commentary on that in the episode. I don't think she does a very good job of executing it at all. Because you have like Anastasia, like as she's dying, being killed by Soul, she's like, "I was gonna let her go with you." Soul didn't even realize that was May. He thought it was Osha, the child who was being taken into the Force as well. Uh, I think you're kind of right on that there is some exploration of that, but I just don't think they do a good job of really kind of uh
Well,
exploring it.
I think
It's there, but it's not done well.
I think it comes down again to, I think a lot of the reason that Disney has gone wrong with Star Wars is they've introduced moral relativism everywhere that they possibly can. They want to say, look, the Sith and the Jedi are two sides of the same coin. And in a way, that's true. They are, they have differing philosophies on the Force and how it is to be used. In that sense, they are two sides of the same coin. But the Sith and the Jedi are not morally equivalent. And I think that's where they're going astray, is they're trying to say, well, look, the Jedi are just as bad. They do the same thing with the New Republic, and say essentially they're just as bureaucratic and short sighted as the Empire, but they're also trying to make the case that they're just as evil and morally compromised. We saw that in The Mandalorian season 3, and that's a nihilistic view, and I don't think that that's anything that George would have ascribed to.
It is the opposite of A New Hope.
Yeah, yeah. It's saying, look, we're all down here in the muck, and there is no system that can govern effectively. And I think that's part of why you can't retain a fan base and have people excited about it. Because how do you get excited about the idea that everybody's incompetent and flawed and there are no heroes? I just don't think that you can tell a Star Wars story with that philosophical outlook.
I think you're onto that because Leslye Headland actually says that that's exactly what she is doing. She says that the show is about breaking down the Jedi as a concept. She said this in an interview with Collider. She was asked, for you as a fan of Star Wars, how much fun has it been to get to pick apart these ideas that have been baked into the franchise for so long and then flip the narrative a little bit and make people look at things from a very different point of view? And she responded, I hope it's making people look at it from a different point of view. I can understand that fans, especially people who don't know the High Republic, may feel like I'm criticizing the Jedi as they exist in George Lucas's oeuvre, meaning the prequels and episodes 5 through 6, but that's not the case. We're so much further back from that. We're only 87 years. It's less than a century. Just to be clear, we're in that era that Obi-Wan is talking about in A New Hope. We're in that period where the proliferation of power is so huge and far-reaching. Actually, in the next episode, you're going to see how far-flung particular missions with Jedi are and the lack of oversight. She then responded in a follow-up question what her actual intention was, and this is what Collider's Lovett said. We get a little bit of a tease of that here in this episode with the whole thing with Rayencourt talking about doing this audit essentially of the Jedi Order, which I think is great. That's very true to where George Lucas was approaching things in the prequels, which is very political, very much a response to that kind of dynamic with the Jedi. I don't really understand what they were even talking about here because I don't really see that in the prequels. The Jedi Council and the Republic were definitely two separate entities. That's very clear, as you have literally Palpatine using Anakin to like spy for him, to spy on the Jedi for him, and the Jedi trying to get Anakin to do the same for them. And obviously, Windu was about to like execute him and everything like that too. So, but anyways, this is how she replied. This is how Leslye Headland replied. Yeah, so comparing these Jedi to the Jedi in the prequels is a little difficult because it's 100-ish years. It's a century. So you see Vernestra's like, we cannot let this happen. She gets more and more concerned about that at the end of the season, and rightfully so, because she, as a very powerful Jedi Master, can sort of see what's on the horizon, whereas when we meet the Jedi in the prequels, they're completely enmeshed at that point. Again, I just don't see that in the prequels. They're not so enmeshed in the Republic that they still operate outside of it. They operate within it, but they are still a separate entity from the actual governing body.
Yeah, I have a slightly different view, but it's not that different. I do think the Jedi went a little bit astray in becoming so beholden to the Senate, and I think that they should have been more removed from the Republic bureaucracy than they ended up being. And I think that that's demonstrated in the prequels partially by the fact that they were so blinded by Palpatine and everything that he was doing. The major red flag for the Jedi should have been the creation of the clone army, because they were creating life in order to sacrifice those bodies on the battlefield so that others wouldn't have to. And that is something that should have been anathema to the Force, and they should have recognized that. We're talking about sacrificing life, not creating it. And because they were so bureaucratic and apart from the people, not acting as stewards of life and the Force itself, that's why their vision was clouded. That was the Force essentially pulling back from them, which should have been a big warning sign. I think it's ironic because Headland has said that she would love to do a Kreia story, and this is why I think she should be as far away from that as she possibly can be, because obviously she cannot do this type of deconstructionist storytelling in an effective way. Knights of the Old Republic 2 does an excellent job of deconstructing the Jedi and the Sith, and doing it through a character, Kreia, who questions everything that you as the player character do, whether you make light side decisions or dark side decisions, and does it in such a way that sounds reasonable and as a way that you may be able to interpret a situation until Kreia reveals what she is. And that is the way you tell this kind of a story. I think that Leslye is so ham-handed and lacks such nuance that she can't tell that kind of story, and that's why she's failing in this endeavor.
Yeah, I actually do agree with you about them being too tied to the Republic. I still think they act as separate entities, but then they do obviously become generals in the war. They are essentially doing everything at the kind of Senate and Republic's behest, and they are allying themselves to and putting their entire like order at the behest of the Republic there at the end. Even though they are still kind of operating at least on a superficial level as separate entities. And I do think that is is one of the problems that they indeed have, because they are sacrificing their actual religious beliefs as the Jedi in favor of the ruling governing body.
Yeah, and it's important to realize too that those clones, even though they have the bodies of full-grown men, they're children. They're no more than 10 years old. So not only are you sacrificing bodies in your religious beliefs in the furtherance of this war, but it's a child sacrifice as well.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. They should. They, especially Yoda. Yoda should have been on that. But
Yep.
going back to what Leslye had to say about this going after the Jedi as a concept, she says this: going back to your question, one of the interesting ways to unpack the Jedi is when they are at their height as they are here. What are the things they're doing differently? A Jedi doesn't pull their weapon unless prepared to kill. That's absolutely not actually shown in the show. There's multiple times where they're pulling their weapon when they're not trying to kill. We see the guy using it as a flashlight multiple times. Just utterly absurd. Anyways, that's just a High Republic concept. They don't have battle droids. They don't have other people with lightsabers. There isn't any reason to pull it. Comparing that to anybody in the prequels, it's not the same. They're just not the same Jedi. As like, I think that's also untrue as well. I mean, as like even like the cursory things I know from the High Republic, and you might know a little bit more, is there are dangers still in the High Republic, especially in this time. There's some kind of like swamp thing like creatures or that are like out there doing things. There are villains. You probably still have piracy. Obviously, the Hutts are probably still operating. There's still cartels. They're still exploring the Outer Rim and all the dangers involved there. I mean, I have seen some of the comic books where they're out on these like remote planets discovering things. So I really don't know what she's talking about here. She's just, again, I think it goes back to what you were saying earlier. This is just kind of her walking back or trying to provide cover for her poor storytelling in a post show interview.
Well, I think some of this is also coming from the initial story group meetings that they had when trying to come up with what the concept of the High Republic was. I don't know if you remember the whiteboard that they had, but
Yes.
one of the things that they talked about was it was not pro-war. You know, that was one of the things they wanted to get away from, and it's a big reason why you don't have the traditional conflict that you have in this era. What they wanted to focus on was the idea of sort of a utopian government that was engaging in these giant public's works projects to expand the influence of the Republic towards the Outer Rim. They wanted to tell more of a frontier style story with a less settled republic as you got to the mid rim and the outer rim. And I think one of the concepts that they probably ended up dealing with, although I don't know how deeply, was how does the mid rim and the outer rim feel about that? Because I mean, if you go back to the prequels at the time of the Phantom Menace, Tatooine is still outside the Republic's influence. You know, they don't have authority there, which is why they can't legally end the slave trade. I think that there's the story I would be telling there is look, you may want to expand the influence of the Republic, but it has to be accepted by the people that you are trying to expand that influence to. Otherwise, you're an imperialist, a colonialist. You're settling areas and conquering them when that's not what those people in those frontier regions want. But I don't think that's the message that they want to send.
Oh, 100%. So then she goes on and says this. So in my opinion, in my experience, and what I was interested in digging into is it seems like it's a time where you can break down the Jedi as a concept, whereas I wouldn't want to touch what has been established of them a century later. So she thinks she can break them down 100 years prior to when they are actually like broken down by and executed by Sidious.
Yeah, I just don't think this works. The High Republic, to me, was always kind of a silly concept because it was Disney wanting to have their version of the Old Republic, but they wisely decided not to meddle in that area because, boy, you think people are mad now. You wait until you see them screwing with that stuff. It just didn't work. I don't think they understood what made the Old Republic work. Part of it was that you were going so far back, 4,000 years for most of the stories in that era, so that you could tell stories that wouldn't impact what was going on in Star Wars current day. And that also allowed you to have sort of an air of legend about it. Everything in the Old Republic was bigger. The Force powers were far more powerful. You had armies of Jedi and Sith that could clash in these giant battlefields. You could have galactic altering events that were ancient history by the time you got to the current era of Star Wars. Now, it should be noted, this also goes against George's conception of what the Jedi and the Sith were. If you read the Phantom Menace novelization, he's always said that there were never giant armies of the Sith. They were always sort of a weak, pathetic little order, and the only way that they could survive was by hiding and having the rule of two from Bane on. They were just this little offshoot that were never a tremendous threat to the Jedi or the Republic. Although there was an indication that at one point the Sith did rule for a brief period before the Jedi deposed them, and Bane took over and instituted the rule of two. So I think the reason that doesn't work for Star Wars as an IP is that if you want to have an ongoing evergreen franchise, you have to be able to continue to tell stories, and that means you have to have the Sith reappearing and being shouted down, and then have some new offshoots show up to have their take at trying to take the crown. So.
I think that kind of does work with how George sets up the Sith, right, and how he talks about the dark side. And it's the dark side is more about you have to be disciplined of yourself. You have to have that self mastery in order to not be tempted by, because the dark side is really just like a corruption of yourself. It's giving into these passions that lead you into doing these kind of evil actions and things like that. And if those are just that's just normal things. That's how we deal with just here as humans. We're constantly fighting those things on a day by day basis as well. And a lot of people do indeed kind of fall to that stuff. And I think it's really easy. It would be really easy to see that kind of like manifested in kind of these other characters. And we have like examples of that. I guess they probably go into Dooku's backstory and how he kind of falls. And there's different ways that people fall into these things. They each have their own kind of like deadly sin that leads them to the dark side.
The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Yeah. I think all I meant was that George's conception was that there was only really one brief period where the Sith ruled, and it was one empire, and then they were cast down and thought that they were eliminated, except for Bane, who instituted the rule of two, and then you had Palpatine, and that was it. The EU conception is that, no, we go way back, and there have been multiple Sith empires and multiple different ways that the Sith govern. But the Jedi have been relatively consistent. Their philosophy has not changed a whole lot, although their governing body has. And the way that they dispatched their Jedi guardians to different systems has changed a little bit. But that had more to do with the fact that a lot of this stuff was written before the prequels came out, and we didn't know there was a Jedi Council and all of that other stuff. So things had to be kind of subtly retconned throughout the years to try and make it all work in a shaky kind of way.
So what would you say that how do you expect this show to end tomorrow? Obviously we're recording this Monday night. You'll probably see this on Monday morning though.
Well, it's hard for me to comment because I haven't watched the show. I've listened to your guys' description of it, and so I don't really know. My guess is that she's going to have or try to have a big revelation. I still suspect that's probably going to have something to do with Darth Plagueis, because she has sprinkled some seeds here and there that point back to the original Darth Plagueis novel. My guess is they're also going to change it in significant ways so that it will not be the Darth Plagueis novel. And so if they do that, my guess is you're going to have a lot of fan outrage again tomorrow. If they don't do that, or if they do it where it is congruent with the Darth Plagueis novel, maybe she'll get some light kudos. But my guess is that overall, the show is going to be regarded as a failure and probably forgotten in a couple of weeks.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Lauren, for joining us here on the Trump Report. Always good to have your perspective on Star Wars and all the knowledge that you bring. So thank you so much for joining us tonight.
You bet. Take care.
All right. Bye.